Well, I want to thank, first of all, Civitas and Heritage for putting this together and inviting me to come and talk to all of you. I hope you don't regret that they did that by the time I'm done talking. I'm going to try and do really two things for you. One, give sort of a lightning, quick, if I can, maybe more speed of sound, but overview of education and how it's been structured in this country from beginning to end. I promise, I'll go fast with this. The reason is that you need to know the context in which we've gotten to Common Core. And then once you know that context, I'm going to tell you something that I hope is more alarming to you, although I think it's factual. Despite what you've heard about this being state-led and voluntary, we know you've heard it hasn't been. What I'm going to tell you is it cannot be state-led and voluntary. So that has implications moving forward that you need to know. Don't think that if you adopt it now, you'll be able to just get out of it. So I'm going to give you some of that. So we're going to start, again, very brief history. If you want more details, you're welcome to ask me afterward. But roughly, from the arrival of the first British settlers till the 1830s, education was something that was primarily based in families, in churches, in civil society. There was very little belief that government should have a role in this. Now, it did change a little in New England when you had a sort of a breakdown of a lot of the institutions that people were used to from England. You know, they're in a totally different environment. There was a requirement that towns provide either someone to provide education, if the town was bigger, also a place to do that. What you need to know is that was often not maintained within New England, and you didn't find that outside of New England. And even more important, still the understanding was that education was something that happened in communities, civil society. So, now, you might have also heard that, well, you know, there were people who were founders in the early Republican era of this country said, no, that we should have a national system of education. That's true. And Noah Webster is often brought up in this regard, or Benjamin Rush. The important thing to understand there is they were in the minority. Again, most people did not believe that there should be anything like a federal or national system of education because most people didn't think government had a particularly large role in education. It was something that was done in communities, in civil society. Now, people will say, well, what about the Northwest Ordinance? You know, the Northwest Ordinance where you a part of every parcel of land that was sold, the proceeds were supposed to go to education. First of all, that preceded the Constitution. And we need to remember the Constitution when we talk about Common Core. It's absolutely true that within federal statute, many times it says the federal government can't control or coerce curriculum. But more importantly, the federal government doesn't actually have any authority to be in education. Nowhere is it among the specific enumerated powers that are the only powers that the federal government has. And this is important because if we ignore that, once we've ignored, kind of ripped up the Constitution, we've now opened ourselves to what we're in now, where the federal government does all sorts of things without any sort of authority to do it. So that's important. The Northwest Ordinance came before this. And of course, Northwest Ordinance was mainly about how the disposition of land, not about education. So the next thing you need to know is education was actually very widespread in this country before the 1830s. Very high rates of literacy. By some estimates, possibly the highest rates of literacy of any country in the world at the time. And this was before the 1830s. And of course, what happened in the 1830s? I'm going to not say nice things about Horace Mann. Yeah. You can applaud if you want, well, later. But so Horace Mann is really, you know, the driver behind the Common Schools movement. I wanted to say Common Core, because obviously that's what we have in mind. But the Common Schools, not coincidentally, they both start with common. But anyway, his idea was not primarily about let's inculcate skills so that people can get good jobs and things like that. His idea was, to a large extent, to homogenize people. To take people who were different and kind of inculcate kind of elite values in them. And so that's just so you have a little understanding of Horace Mann. Then the idea was really to start to consolidate districts. This is the beginning of first the idea that government should be providing uniform education so that to some extent we can make people uniform. And then it was beginning of sort of centralization, but mainly at the district level, consolidation of some small districts, and the beginning of the idea that you should have some uniformity. The first compulsory education law was 1852 in Massachusetts. Shame on you. But the last one of at least the states that existed at the time as states, the last one was 1918, Mississippi. So for less than a century have we even had universal compulsory education. Now you're starting to see that just the system we have is actually something fairly new. And again, this was not even primarily directed by states, much less the federal government. And we continued with centralization mainly through consolidation of districts up till about the 1950s. 1957, something happened that got the federal government involved in a fairly major way for the first time, but connected to national defense. Of course, that was, anybody know? Sputnik, right. Then we get the National Defense Education Act. This is the beginning of federal government major involvement, saying when bad things happen, we need to start to intervene in education. But it was connected to national defense, which of course is a legitimate constitutional area for the federal government to be involved. It wasn't until 1965, and we heard a little bit about this, that we had the federal government get involved in education saying, look, it's something good that we should do. Not connected to national defense really, but it was mainly to help poor people. The Esea was supposed to just be providing compensatory funding, or primarily compensatory funding, for low-income, low-resource districts. Now, that happened 350 years, roughly, after the arrival at Plymouth Rock. That's how long it was before we had any major federal involvement in education, especially in K through 12 education. So this is something very recent in our history. 1979, the Department of Education is created, largely as a payoff to the National Education Association, which supported candidate Jimmy Carter, then President Jimmy Carter, and he had promised that he would create a Department of Education. And that's what they needed to put their force behind him. That now begins to have a major lobby point at the federal government. Then 1983, something called A Nation at Risk is produced. Now this is a report that famously says if a foreign nation had done to us what we've done to ourselves with our education system, we'd consider it an act of war. The important thing is what that then did to the focus of who was starting to direct education and the conversation about education. And it moved toward the federal government. They started to maintain what was called the report card, a big chart of states and outcomes, and people started to look to Washington for direction in education. That hadn't happened before. In 1988, we had the first Esea reauthorization where the federal government starts to say, we are going to require outcomes measures for the money we spend. So remember, before it was compensatory funding. Now they're saying, to an extent rightly, we're spending all this money, but we don't think we're getting anything for it. So they start to say, look, you need to at least show some evidence that your students, being educated with federal money, are making some sort of progress. 1989, we already heard about it, the Charlottesville Summit. Now President Bush, the first President Bush, convenes governors and says, we need to have national education goals. That had not existed before. Now, it was supposed to be, sort of run by states, but of course this was the president convening governors. This was never something that was just state-led and voluntary. Not that people were saying that at the time, but we need to keep this in mind for our context. 1991, you have America 2000. Now again, this is under the Bush administration. They said we should have voluntary standards and tests. This is the first time we're talking about federally directed voluntary standards and tests. Now, efforts to get this done legislatively were defeated, but then Secretary of Education Lamar Alexander, now Senator Lamar Alexander, had discretionary funds at the Department of Education that he used to commission what were supposed to be voluntary national standards. We heard that the history standards were the first ones of these to come out, universally hated. This is a lesson for the Common Core people. And I was at meetings with Common Core people. I was at conferences with Common Core people before there was something called Common Core. And they are very cognizant of the fact that if they started with standards that had real substance to them, like history, they would immediately be defeated. That's why in the English language arts, you don't see any sort of list of reading, because they knew if they specified something, people would have something they could grab onto and object to. In any event, we go to 1994, and what you have is the Bush administration is gone, you have the Clinton administration, and America 2000 really becomes something called Goals 2000. They add 2 national goals, but it's basically America 2000. That's passed in 1984, and so is another reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act called the Improving America's Schools Act. We're now increasing federal direction from the 1988 reauthorization along with Goals 2000. In fact, what Goals 2000 did with Improving America's Schools Act is made it voluntary for states to have national standards by creating something called, I never remember the name, but the National Education Standards and Improvement Council, something called NESIC. That was from Goals 2000. And the Improving America's School Act said, you know what? You will now have to do standards, state tests. You have to show adequate yearly progress, things we've heard now in No Child Left Behind. And the goal of Goals 2000 was to connect this national standards to getting money through the Improving America's School Act. Only really, 2 things, maybe 3 things saved us from it. 2 things. One, 1994, of course, we know that Republicans swept into power, unprecedented, at least since the 50s, and they eliminated this NESIC, this National Education Standards Improvement Council, which was supposed to be the federal entity that said to states, your standards are okay or your standards aren't. So that went away, and then 1994 was when these history standards were released, and you saw this massive national outcry against them. That's why in 1994 we weren't really where we are now. We came very close. 2002, you all know what happened then, the No Child Left Behind Act. It's basically enforcing the Improving America's School Act, which really wasn't enforced. The federal government, especially after 1994, the Clinton administration less inclined to push these things. Most states did not comply with the timeline for having state standards and state tests. But No Child Left Behind said, you will do this. And it seemed that this, I think that the federal government, the Bush administration now, was much more inclined to try and enforce this. It also said you have to have more testing. Now instead of bands of years, it was 3 through 8. Grades 3 through 8, and then once in high school. And it said you had to break out subgroups of students, and it was quite serious about you had to have national standards and tests. So now we see the federal government, for really the first time, setting the framework for every state's education system. You must have state standards. You must have state tests. You must test kids in these age groups. You must break out by various subgroups of students. So they set the framework. What they didn't do is set the content. And what they found was that most states did set very low bars to get to proficiency, to get to adequate yearly progress, because that was what was rational for them to do. Instead of doing hard work getting over high bar, you set the bar really low and say, look, we did it. And so now we get to 2009. Why is 2009 important? This is the stimulus. Now, you'd heard the sort of talk, at least in Washington, D.C. There were people who were talking about having national standards. I went to their meetings, but they didn't believe there was much chance of any widespread adoption. They thought this was going to be a very long battle. But in 2009, you get the stimulus. Of course, you get the stimulus because of massive recession. That's what people are thinking about. That's what people are talking about. And so they put in the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund and then race to the top. And they said, if you want these things, the main things you have to do is, if you want this money, adopt national standards. Now, this is also where you get a lot of the data collection and things like that, which we can talk about. But the important thing is, now you have the federal government saying, we will also dictate the specifics of your standards. And it's a gray area between standards and curriculum. At the very least, though, the point of standards is to set a box around your curriculum. So it has impact on what you're teaching. And then the federal government also said, we will pay for the tests and select the groups to create the tests that go with these things. That's very clearly about curriculum. And we've heard more evidence to that effect. So the federal government has now taken over both the content and the structure of your education system. Then 2011, just kind of icing on the cake, is No Child Left Behind waivers. The No Child Left Behind Act had many onerous, unrealistic requirements in it, and the federal government said, look, if you want to get out of this terrible thing we roped you into, do these other terrible things. One of them is you have to have these national standards, or you did have one out, have your largest state public college system certify your standards as college and career ready, but most states had already promised to adopt Common Core to get Race to the Top money. So even those that didn't get the money said, okay, the easiest thing to do is just say we're going to do what we said we're going to do. So the trajectory is pretty clear. After 2 centuries of little government involvement in education, the government takes over, the 1830s. Roughly 3.5 centuries later, the federal government gets involved, first mainly with compensatory funding, unconstitutional, but at least somewhat innocuous. Except this is what opens the door to control, of course. And then you have about 370 years later, the first federal push on outcomes. 380 years later, the feds are setting standards and testing frameworks. And almost 4 centuries later, the federal government is on the verge of complete control. This is the clear trajectory of centralization we're on. Now, but wait, I won't even say it. I was going to say, someone will say, but this is state-led and voluntary. We know at this point it's not. The important thing to know is it can never be voluntary. Why is this? Well, for one thing, we know it was never intended to be voluntary. In 2008, the NGA and CCSSO put out a report called Benchmarking for Success, which called for federal funding and tiered incentives to get states to sign on to common internationally benchmarked standards. This is before they had the term Common Core. Well, look at Race to the Top. Look at waivers. It's exactly the sort of things they asked for. Funding and regulatory relief. So these people, the Common Core people, were saying the federal government should be driving states toward national standards before they had a Common Core. We know this. It's in print. Why can't it be state-led? Oh, and I should also say, if you used to go on the Common Core State Standards Initiative website, they had the same call for federal involvement in their FAQ section. They've since removed that. And instead, the wording just says, no, but the federal government doesn't make anybody take these. They don't want you to see what they used to say. So why can't it be state-led? Well, a basic fundamental premise behind national standards is that states won't voluntarily hold themselves accountable. They won't set high standards or have rigorous tests or have punishments for how schools do on those tests. And to an extent, that is true. To a large extent, we have seen that states repeatedly won't hold themselves accountable. Why? Because something called concentrated benefits and diffuse costs, largely. It's endemic to government control. The people who would be held accountable are the people who have the most at stake in education policy. Therefore, they are the most involved in education politics. They have disproportionate power just because they have disproportionate motivation. The people they're usually fighting with, or would be fighting with, are taxpayers. Taxpayers have to worry about the whole pie. The special interests, it can be unions, it can be administrator associations, they just worry about their specific part. And so we've seen over and over again, if states ever set a rigorous system, it's gutted because the people you're trying to hold accountable are the ones who are really involved in the politics of education. So national standards supporters talk about, I'm almost done, talk about this tripod. We have to have the common standard and common tests and common punishments, or it doesn't work because there's always a way for a state or school to get out of being held accountable. Well, what is the only entity that has the power to make states do things? It's not supposed to, but in reality it does. Of course, the only entity that can do that is the federal government. It's not a coincidence or a mistake that the Common Core people were pushing for federal power to be behind Common Core to begin with. It's because they had to do it. And to move forward, they're going to have to continue to do it. And it's very clear when you hear them talk about states won't hold themselves accountable. I had other things I was going to say. I've run out of time because, as always, my history wasn't nearly as lightning quick as I thought it would be. I think, though, ultimately, this is the important part to understand. And it really rankles me because in this debate, usually what Common Core supporters say is, well, our opponents are just ignorant. And the things they're saying are crazy, and they're wearing tinfoil hats. But the reality is Common Core opponents basically know what supporters are, at least it seems to me, afraid to say. Common Core is absolutely moving us toward federal control, and that is exactly what they want because it is exactly what they need.